I want to think about James Baldwin. It's his 100th birthday, his centennial, as it were. And I think Baldwin offers us some insight to how we might understand ourselves in this moment, how we arrived here, and how we might imagine a way forward. Is that okay? So I want to begin with a story. Not so much because I'm a storyteller, although there are times when I aspire to be one, but because it is illustrative of what I want to say to you and of what I take to be a kind of wisdom that not only allows us to endure this madness, and we are all on the verge of madness, but also to flourish. I'm reminded of Baldwin's essay, My Dungeon Shook, a letter to my nephew, on the 100th anniversary of the emancipation. In The Fire Next Time, he said, what he had to say to the Howard students can be heard as a distillation of what he tells his nephew. He offers a kind of wisdom born out of hard living. He doesn't want his nephew to suffer the fate of his grandfather, to believe what these folks said about him. He describes America as it is, without the myths and legends that protect its innocence. No, the occasion for this advice, for my words today still, is that we live in a country that has carried its sins forward. We live in a country that has carried its sins forward. And Baldwin, at that moment, when he's talking to his nephew, he's trying to get him to trust his experiences, to believe that he is more than what the world says about him. They have built the world to reflect the belief that somehow the color of their skin accords them value. And we're hearing it in discourses around immigration. We're hearing it we're hearing it again. They've built a world to reflect that belief, but Baldwin tells his nephew to trust his experience, to trust himself at that moment, channeling Ralph Waldo Emerson's self-trust. Right? The details, he says, quote, and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what these folks say about you. And then he tells his nephew, please try to remember that what they believe as well as what they do and cause you to endure does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. In October of 1963, Baldwin published in the Saturday Review, The Negro Child, His Self-Image. And the essay would be retitled A Talk to Teachers, in the edited volume of Baldwin's nonfiction writings, The Price of the Ticket. And like our own, Baldwin acknowledged that he was living in a very dangerous time, and he took up the question of education as a kind of preliminary exploration of the tension between the aim of education to socialize our children in the ways of our society and to equip them with the tools to critically assess our society. Baldwin writes, quote, the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is black or this is white, to describe for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then to learn with those questions is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society, Baldwin writes, is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really ideally want is a citizenry which simply obeys the rules. If a society succeeds in this, Baldwin writes, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself or herself as responsible is to examine society and to try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has, Baldwin writes. This is the only way societies change, end quote. Black and brown children, he suggests, experience a certain kind of dissonance in this regard. They grow up in a society which denies them dignity and standing, where a generalized sense of disregard characterizes the society's view of them. And to develop a critical stance towards this place and its views of black and brown people is to risk death. What is asked and demanded is a kind of consent to a host of assumptions about who you are and to the structures that give those assumptions life. As Baldwin put it, it becomes thoroughly clear, at least to me, that any Negro who is born in this country and undergoes the American educational system runs the risk of becoming schizophrenic. What else is double consciousness but a form of madness? Huh? On the other hand, he is born in the shadow of the stars and stripes, and he's assured it represents a nation which has never lost a war. He's a part of a country in which anyone can become president, and so forth. But on the other hand, he's also assured by his country and his countrymen that he has never contributed anything to civilization, that his past is nothing more than a record of humiliations gladly endured, end quote. But we know better. And it is against this reality in the full light of forces aimed at reproducing hierarchies for exploitation that the black and brown child must forge a self. She must find the means to say no to a society that at every turn seeks to condemn her to a certain station in life. And for Baldwin, through his own autobiographical example, to refuse this sentence amounts to an extraordinary act of the will. One decides, and he doesn't give us much by way of how this happens, but one decides to say no to it all, like Bartleby the Scrivener in Melville, I prefer not to. Huh? If you don't know that, you better write it down. To refuse the categorization and to enter into battle against one's societies, as he wrote, quote, so where we are not is that a whole country of people believes that I'm, excuse my language, this is his language. He said, so where we are not is that a whole country of people believes I'm a nigger and I don't, and so the battle is on. End quote. So for Baldwin, one of the paradoxes of education is precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience. You must find yourself in some way at war with society. Remember, we have to tell the truth. Until we can bear it, and then a little bit more. It is your responsibility to change society if you think of yourself as an educated person. And on the basis of the evidence, moral and political evidence, one is compelled to say that this, Baldwin says, is a backward country. Trump is just the latest evidence. In his essay, The Uses of the Blues, Baldwin clearly states what he takes to be the Negro problem. Quote, I'm talking about what happens to you if, having barely escaped suicide or death or madness or yourself, you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the force of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive. And no amount of liberal jargon and no amount of talk about how well and how far we've progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself. This is the primal scene of instruction. This is the condition under which we reach for higher selves, higher forms of excellences. Why did Langston say life ain't been no crystal state? That Emersonian notion of leaving a self behind and reaching for higher forms of excellences, understanding what it means, right, to reach for a kind of perfectionist impulse in this moment. What does it mean to think about that across the tracks? Under conditions, as Du Bois would say, right, under conditions where you have these two unreconciled strivings, two warring souls, right? For African Americans, to reach for this higher self across the proverbial tracks requires something more fundamental. It requires a confrontation with the reality of this place. There's something monstrous about the country because it refuses to take responsibility for its crimes. Y'all didn't hear me. It's a kind of willful ignorance. The innocence, as Baldwin says, is the crime. And it corroborates what he mercilessly describes as the monstrous quality of this country, embodied in our current political actors. At least one of them. Baldwin says there's something monstrous about never having been hurt, never having been made to bleed, never having lost anything, never having gained anything, because life is so beautiful. And in order to keep it beautiful, you're going to stay just the way you are. And you're not going to test your theory against all the possibilities outside. He says, America is like that. The failure on our part to accept the reality of pain, of anguish, and of ambiguity, of death has turned us into a very peculiar and sometimes monstrous people. America is like Never Never Land, full of lost boys and lost girls. And what's so distinctive about Never Never Land? Nobody wants to be responsible for anything. And we have to bear the burden of it. What does it mean to listen to the advice that Baldwin gave those Howard students? What does it mean to listen to Baldwin think about the paradox at the heart of educating Black and brown children? What does it mean for you to be here trying to imagine yourselves in the most expansive of terms? One of the things I do know as a country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, whose mama had her first baby in the 9th grade, didn't graduate from high school. Dad left early to go to Vietnam and came back home and scared the living daylights out of me from the very moment I took my first breath. What does it mean to imagine yourselves in the most expansive of terms and not be complicit with the world as it is? The thing is that the world conspires to make you small. And the question you have to answer every single day is, will you be complicit? And if you refuse to be complicit, if you refuse to believe what the world says about you, then you're reaching for higher forms of excellences. You're engaging in a self-cultivation. You're engaging in a self-cultivation. In the act of self-cultivation, in the pursuit of a more just world. The world conspires to make you small. The question is, will you be complicit? And if you refuse to be complicit, then I want you to act like John Coltrane. What is that? And what is that? If you refuse to be complicit, I want you to take giant steps. Have you ever listened to that introductory solo in Giant Steps? It's so complex. It's so beyond anything any of the musicians ever heard that when he finished, they didn't know what to do. The pianist is just tapping keys. If the world conspires to make you small and you refuse to be complicit and you take giant steps, leave the world flummoxed. That's one of Toni Morrison's favorite words. Step off the edge of the world like Denver and usher in a new reality.